Do you hear it? The echoes of the past, the whispers of forgotten truths, fragments of memories lost in the shadows. Welcome to BRAINROT, Echoes, where we bring you stories long buried, unravel mysteries cloaked by time, and guide you through the darkest corners of the mind and the universe. Each video is more than just content. It's an echo resonating deep within, urging you to question, to wonder, to explore. Backend index pointing right, hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us in listening to the echoes the world tried to silence. The pen is mightier than the sword and the plasma blaster. Empress Zalara's voice could have shattered crystal at 50 paces. Hell, it probably did shatter crystal at 50 paces, considering the ornate chandelier above her throne was now making concerning tinkling sounds. Her four eyes, two primary, two for enhanced peripheral vision because evolution had a sense of humor, were all focused on General Krathen with the intensity of a supernova having a particularly bad day. "I brought you a human, your imperial magnificence," Krathen replied, his own six eyes doing that thing where they try to look anywhere except directly at the seething monarch before him. "You know that feeling when you're in trouble and you suddenly find the ceiling really interesting? Yeah, it's apparently universal. I asked for an army, Krathen. A whole army. Thousands of soldiers, weapons of mass destruction, something that could help us finally crush the hegemony of Velter once and for all. And you, General, you brought me this?" She gestured with one of her four arms at the figure standing casually beside the general, hands in his pockets like he was waiting for a bus rather than standing in the throne room of the most powerful military leader in three-star systems. The human in question, one James Fletcher, according to his hastily procured identification, had the audacity to wave. Actually wave, like he was meeting his neighbor over the garden fence instead of facing down an 8-foot-tall, four-armed, distinctly irritated alien empress who could have him vaporized with a thought. "Hi there," he said cheerfully. "Love what you've done with the place. Very imposing. The skulls are a nice touch." Zalara blinked all four eyes in sequence, which was her species' equivalent of a double take. "It speaks." "Oh, I do more than speak," Fletcher said, still maintaining that insufferable casualness. "I also whistle, tell jokes, and make a mean grilled cheese sandwich. Though I'm guessing you folks don't do dairy, do you?" Now let me pause here for a moment to explain something about the Zephyrian Empire, because context matters, and I'm nothing if not thorough. The Zephyrians had conquered approximately 67 worlds in the past century alone. They were the kind of species that other species crossed the street to avoid, metaphorically speaking, since most civilized worlds had hover lanes rather than streets. But you get the idea. They were warriors born and bred for combat. Their children played with weapons the way human kids play with blocks. Their equivalent of lullabies were epic ballads about glorious battles and the systematic dismantling of their enemies. They were, in short, not the sort of folks you wanted to meet in a dark nebula. And yet here was this human talking about grilled cheese sandwiches. General Krathen, the Empress, said, her voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that usually preceded someone getting fired, literally fired with plasma cannons. "Explain." Krathen, to his credit, had survived 43 major battles, 16 assassination attempts, and one particularly memorable incident involving a diplomatic dinner and accidentally poisoned soup. He was not easily rattled, but right now, facing down his Empress while trying to explain why he'd returned from a recruitment mission with a single human instead of an army, he looked like he'd rather be back dealing with the poisoned soup. "Well, your Imperial Magnificence, the situation is complex, uncomplicated." Fletcher chose this moment to examine his fingernails with the sort of casual interest usually reserved for checking the weather. "You know, this is fascinating from an anthropological perspective. Do all Zephyrian military briefings involve this much dramatic tension? Or am I just lucky?" For pairs of eyes swiveled to stare at him. He smiled back. "Please continue," he said to Krathen. "Don't mind me." The general cleared his throat, a sound that came out as more of a rumbling growl thanks to his species' unique vocal structure. "As your Imperial Magnificence commanded, I traveled to the human homeworld of Earth to recruit soldiers for our campaign against the Velter hegemony. And I discovered that the humans are—" He paused, clearly struggling with how to phrase this. "Complicated. Complicated how?" Fletcher raised his hand like a student in class. "Ooh, can I feel this one?" "No." Zixandra snapped. "See, that's the problem right there," Fletcher said, completely ignoring her response. "You folks seem to think in very straightforward terms. Conquest, domination, military might. But humans, we're weird. We don't really do the whole join your space empire thing. We're more of a figure-it-out-as-we-go-along species. You will be silent," the Empress commanded, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that had cowed countless alien dignitaries and warlords. Fletcher nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, that's not really going to work either. We don't do silent very well. It's like asking a fish not to swim, or asking a Zephyrian not to dramatically gesture with all four arms when making a point." He demonstrated with his own two arms, which looked rather pathetic in comparison, but got the point across. Crathen coughed again. "Your Imperial Magnificence, if I may continue." "Please do. And, General, this explanation had better be spectacular." "Right. So here's where things get interesting. You see, General Crathen had done his homework before heading to Earth. He'd studied human military history, their weapons technology, their tactical capabilities. On paper, humans looked like decent soldiers, but nothing particularly special. Sure, they'd had some impressive wars among themselves, but every species had those. The Zephyrians themselves had spent 3 centuries fighting themselves before they'd united under the Empire. What Crathen hadn't counted on was meeting actual humans. I arrived at Earth expecting to find a military hierarchy I could negotiate with, Crathen continued. Instead, I found— He paused again, clearly still processing the experience. Chaos. Elaborate. They have approximately 200 separate nations, each with their own military forces, governments, and political systems. Some are democracies, some are dictatorships, some are constitutional monarchies, and some are— He consulted his notes. Something called hot messes, according to one of their diplomats. Fletcher snorted. "That's probably accurate." When I explained that I was seeking to recruit soldiers for the Zephyrian Empire, the response was— Crathen's mandibles clicked together in what his species did instead of shaking their heads. "Varied. How varied?" Some wanted to study our technology. Some wanted to trade with us. Some wanted to negotiate treaties. Some wanted to fight us immediately to test their strength against ours. And some wanted to invite me to something called a barbecue and discuss intergalactic cultural exchange over beer and hot dogs. Zixandra's expression was the kind usually reserved for discovering that your favorite general had suffered a complete mental breakdown. "And you chose—" "I attended the barbecue," Crathen admitted. "It seemed diplomatic." Fletcher grinned. "That was probably the right call, actually. You can learn more about humans over a barbecue than in a dozen formal meetings." "This is what I discovered," Crathen said, warming to his theme now. "Humans don't think like us. They don't think like anyone. They approach problems from angles that shouldn't exist. Their military tactics are—" He struggled for words. "Creative. Creative how?" "They once won a major war by convincing their enemies that they had a massive army positioned in one location, when in reality it was inflatable tanks and cardboard cutouts." Zixandra blinked. That's cheating. That's humans," Fletcher said cheerfully. "We're not big on fighting fair. We prefer fighting smart. They defeated a naval blockade," Crathen continued, "by using civilian fishing boats. They've won battles by retreating in ways that looked like advances. They've used everything from exploding livestock to weaponized music as military tactics." "Weaponized music?" "Heavy metal at maximum volume," Fletcher explained. "Turns out most species find it psychologically disturbing." Who knew? The Empress was beginning to look like someone who'd bitten into what she thought was a sweet fruit and discovered it was actually a very sour, very confusing vegetable. "General, this still doesn't explain why you brought me one human instead of an army." "Ah," Crathen said, and now he was starting to look slightly more confident. That's where the story gets interesting. Fletcher checked an imaginary watch on his wrist. This should be good. After spending several weeks on Earth, studying their various military forces and trying to understand their culture, I realized something important. Humans don't work well as traditional soldiers in foreign armies. They ask too many questions. They want to understand the cause they're fighting for. They have moral qualms about certain types of warfare. He searched for the right word. Difficult. So you gave up? No, your imperial magnificence. I found something better. Zixandra leaned forward in her throne, all four arms gripping the armrests. Better than an army? I found a consultant. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes you check if your hearing has suddenly stopped working. Fletcher used the opportunity to examine the impressive collection of alien weapons mounted on the throne room walls. A consultant, the Empress repeated slowly. A human consultant, Crathen clarified. You see, humans may not make good soldiers for other people's wars, but they make excellent problem solvers for other people's problems. Fletcher turned back to the conversation. It's true. We're basically the universe's troubleshooters. Got a problem you can't solve? Call a human. We'll figure out some ridiculous solution that shouldn't work, but somehow does. Mr. Fletcher here, Crathen continued, has a rather unique background. He was a military strategist for one of Earth's major powers, specializing in asymmetric warfare and unconventional tactics. After that, he worked as a consultant for various organizations, solving problems that traditional approaches couldn't handle. What kind of problems? Zixandra asked despite herself. Fletcher shrugged. Oh, how to move 1 million refugees across a war zone without anyone noticing. How to disable an enemy communications network using household appliances. How to negotiate a ceasefire between two species that communicate through interpretive dance and chemical emissions, respectively. That last one was particularly challenging, Crathen added. I've seen the documentation. Fascinating stuff. The Empress sat back in her throne, her arms crossed in a pattern that somehow managed to look both defensive and thoughtful. So, instead of bringing me an army to crush the Velter hegemony, you brought me a single human who, thinks outside the box. I brought you a human who doesn't know boxes exist, Crathen corrected. Your Imperial Magnificence. We've been fighting the hegemony for 6 years. 6 years of conventional warfare, traditional tactics, straightforward military campaigns. And where has it gotten us? The question hung in the air like a particularly uncomfortable truth. The war against the Velter hegemony. Well, calling it a stalemate would have been generous. It was more like two titans locked in an eternal wrestling match, neither able to gain a decisive advantage, both slowly wearing themselves down in the process. The situation is, Zixandra admitted grudgingly, suboptimal. Right, Fletcher said. So here's my question. What if you've been approaching this whole thing wrong? Wrong how? Well, for starters, you're fighting a war the way your enemy expects you to fight it. Big fleets, big battles, big dramatic confrontations. But what if they're expecting that because they're good at that kind of fighting? The Velter are formidable opponents, Zixandra conceded. Their technology is nearly equal to ours. Their tactical acumen is considerable, and their resolve is... She paused. Annoyingly persistent. Exactly, Fletcher said. So you're playing their game, by their rules, on their terms. How's that working out for you? The silence was answer enough. Fletcher walked over to examine one of the weapons on the wall, some sort of plasma rifle that probably cost more than most planets' annual budgets. You know what I did before I agreed to come here? Enlighten us, the Empress said dryly. I spent 3 days reading everything I could find about the hegemony. Their history, their culture, their military doctrine, their political structure, their trade relationships, their art, their literature, their mating rituals. Their mating rituals? Crathen interrupted. Hey, you never know what's going to be relevant, Fletcher said. The point is, I try to understand them as completely as possible. And you know what I found? What? They're bureaucrats. Another silence. This one had a distinctly, what the hell are you talking about, quality to it. They're a hierarchical society with a complex administrative structure, Fletcher continued. Every decision has to go through proper channels. Every action requires appropriate authorization. Every military operation needs to be approved by at least 3 different committees and filed in triplicate. This is accurate, Zixandra admitted slowly. Their response times to our attacks have always been somewhat methodical. Right, Fletcher said. They're not slow because they're bad at warfare. They're slow because they're good at bureaucracy. Different skill sets. Fletcher turned back to face the throne. So what if instead of trying to outfight them, we outmaneuver them administratively? Crathen's mandibles clicked together rapidly, the Zephyrian equivalent of excited murmuring. What do you mean? I mean, what if we made them so tied up in their own red tape that they couldn't effectively prosecute the war? What if we turned their greatest strength, their organizational structure, into their greatest weakness? The Empress leaned forward again. Continue. Well, here's the thing about bureaucracies, Fletcher said, settling into his explanation like a professor warming up to his favorite subject. They're incredibly efficient at handling normal, predictable situations, but they're terrible at dealing with unusual, unprecedented, or just plain weird scenarios. They don't have procedures for the truly bizarre, and humans specialize in the truly bizarre. We don't just specialize in it, Fletcher corrected. We weaponize it. He began pacing, hands still in his pockets, looking for all the world like someone discussing weekend plans rather than military strategy. See, the Velter expect certain types of attacks: fleet engagements, planetary bombardments, strategic resource raids, diplomatic pressure campaigns. They have procedures for all of that. Committees, response protocols, chain of command structures. Yes, Zixandra said impatiently. We know all this. But do they have procedures for handling a situation where all their military communications are being interrupted by what appears to be an alien species trying to sell them extended warranties for their starships? The throne room fell silent, except for the distant hum of the palace's environmental systems. I'm sorry, what? The Empress finally managed. Spam calls, Fletcher explained helpfully. Except instead of trying to sell them car insurance, we're interrupting every military frequency with increasingly ridiculous offers. Greetings, warriors. Have you heard about our exciting new timeshare opportunities in the Horsehead Nebula? Crathen made a sound that might have been a laugh if a species did laughter the same way humans did. That's insane. That's the point, Fletcher said. How do you write a military procedure for dealing with cosmic telemarketers? Do you hang up? Do you try to trace the calls? Do you file a complaint with some intergalactic consumer protection agency? And while they're trying to figure out the proper bureaucratic response, their communications network is completely useless. But that's just communications, Zixandra pointed out. One system. Oh, that's just the beginning, Fletcher said with a grin that probably should have been illegal in several star systems. See, once you start thinking outside conventional warfare, the possibilities are endless. He began counting on his fingers. What if their supply ships keep getting delayed because someone's filing environmental impact reports claiming that their cargo is disturbing the migration patterns of space whales? What if their military bases keep getting visited by door-to-door missionaries from a made-up religion who insist on explaining their beliefs in excruciating detail? What if their battle plans keep getting leaked to their own media, but with crucial details changed so they can't tell what's real intelligence and what's disinformation? Space whales aren't real, Crathen pointed out. Are you sure? Have you checked? Because I've got some very official-looking documentation here that says otherwise. Fletcher pulled a tablet from his jacket and waved it vaguely. Very concerned about their breeding grounds, apparently. The Empress was staring at him with the expression of someone trying to decide if they were dealing with a genius or a complete lunatic. This is your strategy? Bureaucratic harassment. It's one element of a multi-layered approach, Fletcher said. The beauty of fighting a bureaucratic enemy isn't that you destroy them. It's that you make them destroy themselves. You bog them down in their own systems, create problems that require increasingly complex solutions, force them to spend more time managing the chaos than fighting the war. And while they're distracted, you hit them where they're not expecting it. See, conventional military thinking assumes your enemy is paying attention to you. But what if they're not? What if they're too busy trying to figure out whether the complaint they received about their fleet's parking violations is legitimate? Zixandra stood up from her throne, all 8 feet of her imposing presence suddenly focused with laser intensity. General Crathen, you said this human was a consultant. What exactly has he consulted on? Crathen straightened to attention. Mr. Fletcher's most recent assignment was resolving a trade dispute between the Rigelian Collective and the Centauri Federation. The conflict had been ongoing for 18 months, with both sides mobilizing military forces and preparing for what analysts expected to be a devastating war. And he resolved it in 6 days? How? Fletcher shrugged. I convinced both sides that the disputed trade route was actually haunted by the ghost of an ancient space pirate who demanded tribute in the form of really good coffee. They were so busy arguing about whether ghosts were real and what constitutes really good coffee that they forgot what they were fighting about in the first place. But that's ridiculous. Sure, Fletcher said, but it worked. No war, no casualties, no destroyed planets. Just a lot of very confused diplomats and a surprisingly robust interstellar coffee trade. The Empress looked at Crathen. Is this true? I have the documentation, Your Imperial Magnificence. Both governments officially recognized the Phantom Pirate Protection Treaty as legitimate interstellar law. There's now a permanent coffee tribute station at the disputed coordinates. And it's actually improved trade relations between the two systems, Fletcher added. Turns out sharing a mutual belief in absurd cosmic nonsense is a great foundation for friendship. Zixandra began pacing, which was an impressive sight given her size and the way her forearms moved in complex, synchronized patterns when she was thinking. So your proposal is to, what, drive them insane? Not insane, Fletcher corrected. Just very, very busy. See, the thing about bureaucratic systems is that they can handle a lot of problems, but they handle them sequentially, one issue at a time. Proper procedures, appropriate documentation. But if you hit them with 50 different bizarre problems simultaneously, they become paralyzed. Crathen finished, unable to respond effectively to any of them. Exactly, Fletcher said. And while they're trying to sort out whether the petition to declare their capital planet a historical monument has legal standing, or whether the complaint about their military uniforms violating intergalactic fashion standards is legitimate, or whether they really do need to provide environmental impact assessments for their fleet movements, we destroy them. We don't need to destroy them, Fletcher said. They'll do that themselves. Bureaucracies are incredibly fragile when they can't function normally. Remove their ability to process information efficiently, and they collapse under their own weight. The throne room was quiet for a long moment as Zixandra processed this. Finally, she turned to Crathen. General, your assessment? Your Imperial Magnificence. In 43 years of military service, I have never encountered anything like human strategic thinking. It's unconventional to the point of seeming random, but there's an underlying logic to it that's effective. Effective how? Mr. Fletcher spent his first week here analyzing our intelligence reports on the Velter. In that time, he identified 17 different vulnerabilities in their command structure that our strategists had never considered, such as Fletcher cleared his throat. For example, did you know that their military procurement system requires personal approval from a committee of 7 senior officials for any purchase over a certain amount? And that this committee only meets twice per month? And that all 7 members have to be physically present. So what happens if one of those officials is unavoidably detained? Say, stuck in a very long customs inspection because someone reported suspicious items in their luggage? Suddenly, the entire procurement system grinds to a halt. But that's just one person, right? But what if all 7 officials, completely coincidentally, find themselves dealing with various minor but time-consuming legal issues? Parking tickets that require court appearances, property disputes that need mediation, allegations of minor tax irregularities that require extensive documentation. Zixandra's eyes widened as she began to see the scope of what he was suggesting. You would systematically disrupt their entire administrative apparatus. It's like pulling threads from a tapestry, Fletcher said. Pull the right threads, and the whole thing unravels. The beauty is, none of it looks like warfare. It's just bureaucratic misfortune. But surely they would realize what was happening. Would they? Fletcher said. I mean, bureaucratic problems happen all the time in complex organizations. Systems glitch, paperwork gets lost, officials get sick, meetings get canceled. How do you prove that it's enemy action rather than just really bad luck? Crathin made that clicking sound again. And even if they did realize it was deliberate, what's their recourse? File a complaint with some intergalactic authority about being administratively harassed. Who would they file it with? Fletcher asked innocently. And what would the proper procedure be? How long would it take to process? Would they need to provide documentation, witnesses, evidence? The Empress sat back down, her expression shifting from skeptical to thoughtful to something that might have been anticipation. This is actually brilliant. It's definitely something, Fletcher agreed. The question is whether you're willing to try a completely different approach to warfare. How different? Well, for starters, instead of building more weapons, we need to build a really good legal department. A legal department? Oh yes, we're going to need lawyers. Lots and lots of lawyers. The kind who can write contracts in 17 different languages and find loopholes in treaties that haven't been ratified yet. The kind who can turn a simple trade agreement into a document so complex that it requires its own index. Zixandra looked at Crathin. Do we have lawyers? We have military lawyers, Your Imperial Magnificence. Not the same thing, Fletcher said. Military lawyers are trained to work within existing systems. We need lawyers who can create new systems. Lawyers who can write legislation that technically complies with interstellar law while being completely impossible to understand or implement. Where will we find such lawyers? Fletcher grinned. Earth has plenty of them. The conversation continued for another hour, with Fletcher outlining increasingly elaborate schemes for bureaucratic warfare. By the end, he had convinced the Empress to authorize a completely unprecedented military campaign based not on superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but on strategic irritation and administrative chaos. Which brings us to 6 months later, when the Velter hegemony formally surrendered to the Zeperian Empire. Not because they'd been defeated in battle. There had been remarkably few actual battles. Not because their military had been destroyed. Their military was largely intact. Not because their planets had been conquered. Most of their territory remained under their control. They surrendered because their government had become completely non-functional. It started small, a few communication disruptions, some minor supply delays, occasional administrative glitches. Nothing that seemed significant on its own. But then the problems began multiplying. Military communications were constantly interrupted by increasingly bizarre commercial messages. Supply shipments were delayed due to environmental impact studies, safety inspections, and regulatory compliance issues. Battle plans were leaked to media outlets, but with crucial details altered in ways that made it impossible to distinguish real intelligence from disinformation. Individual officials found themselves dealing with an endless stream of minor legal issues. Parking violations, property disputes, tax audits, licensing problems, noise complaint from neighbors about their fleet exercises, Allagat. Ions that their uniforms violated various safety and fashion regulations. Military bases were visited by religious missionaries, environmental activists, consumer advocacy groups, historical preservationists, and representatives from organizations with names like the Intergalactic Committee for the Ethical Treatment of Artificial Intelligence and citizens concerned about the psychological welfare of military personnel. Every action they took triggered new bureaucratic requirements. Every problem they solved created 3 new problems. Every decision required approval from committees that couldn't meet because their members were dealing with their own administrative crisis. Within 4 months, the Velter government was spending more time managing bureaucratic chaos than fighting the war. Military operations were delayed or canceled because the proper paperwork couldn't be processed. Strategic decisions were postponed because the officials authorized to make them were tied up in legal proceedings. The final straw came when someone, nobody ever figured out who, filed a formal complaint with the Velter Department of Historical Preservation, claiming that the entire war was disturbing the habitat of an endangered species of quantum bacteria that allegedly lived in the space-time continuum around contested star systems. The complaint was obviously ridiculous. Quantum bacteria weren't real, the science was nonsensical, and the legal precedent was non-existent. But it was filed through proper channels, with appropriate documentation, following correct procedures. And according to law, military operations had to be suspended in any area where environmental impact was under investigation until the matter could be resolved. The investigation required input from 17 different government departments, approval from 3 separate committees, and testimony from expert witnesses in fields ranging from quantum biology to interstellar environmental law. The process was estimated to take between 18 months and 3 years. Faced with the choice between continuing a war they could no longer effectively prosecute or surrendering to an enemy who had somehow weaponized paperwork, the Velter chose surrender. The surrender ceremony was held on a neutral space station, with representatives from both sides signing treaties that Fletcher had helped draft. The documents were masterpieces of bureaucratic complexity, technically legal, practically incomprehensible, and structured in ways that made future conflicts virtually impossible due to the administrative requirements involved. So, Zixandra said to Fletcher as they watched the Velter delegation depart, looking shell-shocked and carrying several cargo containers full of documentation they were required to file with various intergalactic authorities. "What's next?" Fletcher shrugged, hands back in his pockets. "Well, that depends. Are there any other wars you need help not fighting?" "Not fighting? Think about it. We just won a 6-year war without firing a shot. No casualties, no destroyed planets, no refugee crises. Just a lot of very confused bureaucrats and an impressive expansion of interstellar administrative law. The Empress considered this. That is preferable to traditional warfare. Plus, now you've got the Velter as subjects instead of enemies. They're still a highly organized, technologically advanced civilization. They're just organized under your authority now instead of their own. And they're too tied up in administrative procedures to rebel. They're too tied up in administrative procedures to do anything quickly," Fletcher corrected. "Which means you'll have plenty of advanced warning if they try anything. Plus, they're going to be spending the next decade just trying to understand the surrender terms." Crathen approached, carrying a datapad that was making urgent beeping sounds. "Your Imperial Magnificence, we've received a communication from the Andromedan Consortium. They're confused about something." "What kind of confused?" "They're asking if we know anything about the registration paperwork they've been receiving for a mandatory census of non-corporeal entities and interdimensional travelers in their territory." Fletcher examined his fingernails with renewed interest. "That sounds like a reasonable administrative requirement." "Mr. Fletcher," the Empress said slowly, "did you?" "I may have filed some paperwork on behalf of various fictional organizations," he admitted. Just to keep things interesting." "What kind of paperwork?" "Oh, nothing major. Just some forms requesting information about compliance with various made-up regulations. The kind of thing that takes months to sort out, but looks official enough that you can't just ignore it." Zixandra looked at the datapad, then at Fletcher, then back at the datapad. "Are you suggesting that we could expand our administrative influence across the galaxy without actually conquering anyone?" Fletcher smiled. "I mean, it's a thought. After all, if you can regulate someone's behavior, do you really need to conquer their territory?" And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the Zepyrian Empire became the galaxy's first bureaucratic superpower. Not through conquest or military might, but through the strategic application of paperwork, red tape, and one human's deeply twisted understanding of how to turn administrative systems into weapons of mass confusion. Fletcher eventually returned to Earth, where he wrote a best-selling book called Intergalactic Bureaucracy: How to Conquer the Universe Without Firing a Shot. It became required reading at diplomatic academies across 3 star systems. The Zepyrian Empire continued to expand, not through military conquest, but through administrative absorption. Other civilizations found themselves gradually integrated into Zepyrian bureaucratic systems, often without realizing it was happening until they discovered they needed permits from Zephyrian authorities for activities they'd been doing for centuries. The Velter, meanwhile, became model citizens of the Empire, largely because they were still trying to figure out what they'd agreed to in the surrender documents. By the time they finished reading the fine print, they'd been successfully integrated into Zephyrian society and had to admit the new system was actually more efficient than their old one. And Empress Exandra learned that sometimes the best way to get what you want isn't to demand it directly, but to make not giving it to you more complicated than just saying yes in the first place. As Fletcher had noted in his book's dedication, to the universe's bureaucrats, who prove every day that the pen is mightier than the sword, the death ray, and the planet-destroying superweapon combined. Because at the end of the day, everyone's afraid of paperwork.